move on to the next item of business. The next item of business is a Stage 1 debate on motion 22226 in the name of Daniel Johnson on the Protection of Workers, Retail and Age-Restricted Goods and Services Scotland Bill. Can I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Daniel Johnson to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by saying that it is quite a moment for me. Rising to speak in favour of my own bill brings with it a real sense of responsibility. And with that in mind, can I move the motion in my name before I forget to do so? But I must pay tribute to the various organisations that have supported the development of this bill and have campaigned with me to promote it. It has been hugely rewarding to campaign with trade unions such as USDAW, GMB and Unite, as well as employers such as the Grocers Federation, Scottish Retail Consortium, NFRN, ScotMid and the Cooperative Group. This is a cause where unions and employers are of one view, and that alone should say something of the importance of this issue. I'd also remind the Chamber of my register of interest as a member of USDAW, the Cooperative Party and a director of our company with retail interests. I'd also like to thank the Economy and Fair Work Committee for their thorough and very helpful scrutiny of the bill. And finally, I'd also like to thank the NGBU for all their help, advice and assistance through the process. And finally, I'd also like to thank Ash Denham for her very constructive engagement in recent weeks and months regarding this piece of legislation. We are now 6 months into this pandemic and has brought with it a sharp focus on the crucial role that shop workers provide, making sure we can obtain the bare necessities and essentials for life. And in turn, shop workers have stepped up to keep us safe when we do so. But it has also exacerbated disturbing behaviours from a very small minority who, when faced with these restrictions, have responded with abuse, threats and violence towards shop staff, who are simply trying to uphold those rules and keep us all safe. USDAW, the Shop Workers Union, estimates that such incidents have doubled during the pandemic, and they report that almost 70% of retail workers cite enforcing social distancing requirements as the biggest single cause of abuse and violence they face at work. So this pandemic has undoubtedly brought into sharp focus the need for this legislation. Shop workers have been at the front line of the response, and as a consequence they have faced abuse and assault. That is completely unacceptable. So let me put this very simply. Violence, threats and abuse are simply not just part of the job for anyone, whether you work behind a desk or behind a shop counter. But it should not have taken the pandemic to provide this insight. Challenge 25 over recent years has become the norm. There are dozens of goods and services that require customers to prove their age when purchasing. But what most people don't realise is that it is shop workers themselves that are liable if they fail to ask for proof of age. They can receive a £5,000 fine or prison time if they sell an item or a service to an individual without checking ID. Yet it's this same legal duty that also triggers instances of abuse and violence. According to USDAW, 15 shop workers are assaulted every single day in Scotland. The Grocers Federation report that half of their members receive abuse on a daily basis because they are asking for ID. Of course.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way, and I agree with all he said so far. How does he feel about other workers who are not retail workers? Should they also be protected?
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the member for his intervention, and it's a useful one. Unfortunately, I'm a simple, solitary member, and this is a piece of members' legislation. I think there is a case for looking at the protections that all public-facing workers could and should enjoy. But also critically, and the point I'll come on to is retail workers are legally duty-bound to uphold the law. And there is a clear parallel with other such workers who enjoy the specific protection of the law when they do so. And this is the basic principle that my bill focuses on, that when we ask people to uphold the law, they should have the specific protection of the law. Emergency workers, customs officers, border staff, tax inspectors all have such protection as a matter of statute. This principle and imperative was clear before the pandemic, and why I introduced my members' bill to the Scottish Parliament to recognise the important legal duty fulfilled by people working behind shop counters. The drafting and language used in my bill is directly comparable both with Section 90 of the Police and Fire Reform Act and the Emergencies Workers Act. When the Emergency Workers Act was introduced in response to growing attacks on ambulance crews and firefighters, its necessity and rationale were questioned. But this is a law that has been used in more than 3,000 prosecutions since its introduction. And so this principle is clear. The legislative approach is well established, and it is also clear that such protections are effective. My bill has two central provisions. First, it creates a specific offence of assaulting a shop worker. Secondly, it creates a statutory aggravation where the offence occurs in relation to the sale of an age-restricted good or service. The creation of a new statutory offence plays three important functions. Firstly, it creates a clear legal scope and effect, which is in turn important for the statutory aggravation. Secondly, it provides a clear articulation in law that these behaviours are unacceptable. As Lord Brackadale stated in his review on hate crime, it is a legitimate function of the law to communicate. Indeed, this point was particularly highlighted by trade unions and trade bodies in their evidence to the committee, drawing parallels with other behaviours which, while were covered by other pieces of legislation or common law, required specific legislation before that law was effective. Thirdly, the creation of a new specific offence will provide much better data. Right now, we simply do not know the true scale of this problem, as these types of crime are not recorded separately. As a result, we are reliant on survey work such as that carried out by USDAW, SGF and the Scottish Retail Consortium. This is particularly concerning given the concerns articulated to the committee and reflected in the report regarding the underreporting of abuse, threats and assaults on retail workers. But perhaps the most important element of the bill is the aggravation. This places into law the seriousness of assaulting someone when they are undertaking their legal duty as required in statute. It will ensure that sentencers give due consideration for those committing these crimes when they pass sentence. In addition to these core elements, the bill in its current form would make it an offence to obstruct or hinder a retail worker carrying out their duties. This concept was taken from the Emergency Workers Act, and the intention was to prevent the familiar pattern of escalation, where a simple refusal of sale results in someone refusing to move from a queue or move on, and that escalates to abuse, threats, and then on to violence. However, I note the committee's concerns regarding this provision, and I agree that it was too broadly drawn. As a consequence, it is my intention to bring forward an amendment at stage 2 to remove this provision from the bill. It is also important to note the scope of this bill. In drafting it, a number of decisions were required and options considered. I wanted this bill to be focused and to the point, but I also wanted it to recognise the broad range of contexts in which age-restricted goods and services are sold, and also the changing nature of retail. As a result, the bill defines retail work in such a way that those working in bars, restaurants and hotels will be covered. Likewise, it will cover delivery drivers who are required to ask for ID when delivering age-restricted items. They too will be covered by this bill. Shop workers provide a vital frontline service. And while the pandemic has brought new insight into the critical role played by these workers, the reality is that they always have done. They keep us safe. They uphold the law. Let's take this opportunity to ensure that they have the protection of the law. It is the very least we owe them for their vital public work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Gordon Lyndhurst to open for the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee.
As the saying goes, Deputy Presiding Officer, the customer is always right. It was the founders of Selfridges and the Ritz Hotel who first popularised the phrase. And variations of the theme include the customer is king, the customer is never wrong, the customer always has a reason. Even in perhaps its most extreme form, the customer is a god, spelt with a small g, of course. But unfortunately, there are times when the customer is in reality not right. There are times when the customer abandons all reason. Daniel Johnson's bill relates to those times and the protection of shop workers. Now, our appreciation of people who work in retail has grown during these COVID times. Supermarket staff, the man or woman in the corner shop, those behind the counter in pharmacies. Their role over the last 6 months has proved invaluable, and we've acknowledged them all as key workers, and rightly so. What we require from this bill, should it be passed, is that it be effective, that shop workers feel not only valued, but safe, free to go about their work without fear, now and beyond the current restrictions. Indeed, much of the committee work on the bill preceded the pandemic, and the committee wanted to hear the views of shop workers and members of the public. In February, a pop-up Parliament stand was held in Paisley's Piazza Shopping Centre. We asked retail workers and shoppers what they made of the bill and whether they thought extra protection was necessary. Now, most people there who spoke to the committee on that day said it was. A central plank of the bill is the recognition that those required to ask for proof of age should have additional protection, on the basis that workers, as Daniel Johnson has mentioned, who enforce statutory age restrictions are upholding the law. And this can be a trigger for acts of violence and abuse. The evidence of such behaviour against retail workers was found to be compelling by the committee, and the committee believed that it must be addressed. As a shopkeeper from Blantyre said in a recent newspaper article, shop workers aren't looking for a pat on the back, but they don't need a kicking either. The committee's Stage 1 report encouraged the member in charge to speak to the Minister and to address the concerns that the committee had with the bill about its scope and the definition of retail work. We also invited the Scottish Government to reflect on several areas: reporting of incidents, data collection, and awareness raising. What we've heard about the dialogue and the reflection on these points is encouraging. And hopefully I'm not overly repeating what the member in charge himself has just said, or indeed preempting anything the Minister plans to tell us. But I understand the Minister shares the committee's concerns regarding the obstruct and hinder element of the bill, and that she has indicated a willingness to continue her dialogue with the member on this through to Stage 2. So let me pick up on a couple of those other strands, if I may. Reporting and confidence in the system are closely entwined, and there is a perception that the abuse of retail workers is not taken seriously by the police, that current laws are not being enforced. And that was a matter of worry to the committee, because employers and employees should be encouraged to report crimes. The bill can raise awareness, but action must be taken regardless. The committee invited the Scottish Government to work with its justice partners to address enforcement issues and ensure these matters be given the priority called for. In her written response, the Minister said that operational matters sit with Police Scotland, but she also said the Scottish Government would be happy to assist in any way it can. So perhaps she could elaborate on that in a moment when she comes to address us. Now, the Minister also argued that a defence of reasonableness should be added to the bill, which is a concern the committee recognised and recommended be considered at Stage 2. And no doubt the Minister will have comment to make on that as well. Now, a recurring theme in the evidence to the committee was, the importance of communication. The Law Society of Scotland recognised, and I quote, an overwhelming need for enhanced provision of education, training, and awareness raising of the issue to the public. The Federation of Small Businesses called for a, quote, smart, well-resourced marketing campaign. Now, we agree as a committee with the need to promote cultural change to deter aggressive behaviour and give shop workers the recognition they deserve. We called for the Scottish Government to work with retailers and others on an educational campaign, one that will target retail workers, employers and the public. And it is pleasing the Minister has given a commitment to do just that. She has suggested the focus will be on small retail outlets whose staff may feel more vulnerable. So we look forward again to hearing more when she sets out her position. Daniel Johnson told us previous attempts to introduce similar legislation resulted in warm words, but that those seeking protection were left in the cold, that nothing happened. Thomas Hobbes said in Leviathan, "The law is the public conscience," or at least, Deputy Presiding Officer, it should be. The committee has made clear its concerns about certain aspects of the bill. We welcome the continuing discussions between Daniel Johnson and the Scottish Government. We commend the member for bringing forward this bill and also the Minister for being attentive to the committee's findings. The committee supports the general principles of the bill.
Thank you very much. I now call on Ash Denham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to begin by recognising the important role that retail workers play within our local communities and also the wider Scottish economy. And during the COVID-19 outbreak, that contribution has been highlighted as the retail trade help communities across Scotland get through these very challenging times. And I appreciate the hard work and commitment of all those working in the retail sector in Scotland. As such, they should be lauded for the work they are continuing to do during these challenging and unprecedented times. And it's absolutely right that retail workers should be protected by our criminal laws. Every worker in a frontline customer service role should feel absolutely safe and supported. And Daniel Johnson's Protection of Workers Bill is a well-intentioned and also a well-timed given COVID-19. I'd like to thank the committee for their thoughtful Stage 1 report, as well as the clerks who have assisted in preparing the report. And, Presiding Officer, the job we all have in this Parliament is, as the committee report said, to assess whether this bill will help to improve how the criminal law in the area of protections for retail workers will operate. So evidence to the committee showed that retail workers are exposed to verbal abuse, to threatening and abusive behaviour, and also to physical attacks and things like spitting and other types of disorderly behaviour. And we've heard that this often occurs when people are under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or when the retail worker is carrying out age checks or enforcing core hours for sale of alcohol. So let me be really clear. This type of criminal conduct is absolutely unacceptable, and perpetrators should be held to account. Retail workers should feel they're currently protected by the criminal law, and they are protected, of course. We have a wide range of existing criminal laws in place to tackle this type of offending behaviour. So the statutory offence of threatening or abusive behaviour, the common law offence of assault, and the common law offence of breach of the peace. These existing laws criminalise the verbal and physical abuse of our retail workers and provide our courts with the discretion to impose robust maximum penalties. Enforcement of this law is, of course, for Police Scotland and the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and ultimately the criminal courts. And I fully support the law enforcement agencies in taking that robust enforcement action to deal with any attacks and threats made against retail workers if they consider that necessary in any given case. However, the context for this bill is to listen to the concerns that have been raised by a number of trade unions, such as the Union of Shop, Distributive and Allied Workers, and from a number of retail bodies, such as the Scottish Retail Consortium, as they explained why they are in support of this bill. And I pay tribute to Daniel Johnson. It's not easy, I think, navigating the Members' Bill process, even with the help of the excellent non-government bills unit in the Parliament. And Daniel Johnson's bill has already helped raise awareness, I think, of this very important issue. We appreciate that such a bill will have the potential to make the public think more about their behaviour when they're interacting with retail workers, especially in such difficult and challenging times. The committee recognised in their report that the new offence contained in the bill largely restates existing offences, and where it seeks to extend the law by including hindering and obstructing as elements of the offence, we consider it does so in a way that sets too low a threshold for criminal sanctions. And the committee's Stage 1 report shared that concern, and they indicated in the report, and I quote, that they share concerns raised about the practical impact of including obstruct and hinder as an offence against retail workers, and believe this could be open to misinterpretation as currently framed in the bill. End of quotation. So, subject to changes being made in this area during Stage 2 to remove the hindering and obstructing elements, I can advise that the Scottish Government will support this bill through the legislative process, including, of course, at decision time this evening. So the approach would ensure that the seriousness of offending is highlighted through a specific offence. The court, when sentencing, assess whether higher sentences are required in the context of age verification, and allow for better data to be collected over a period of time. And I understand from discussions with Daniel Johnson that he'd be agreeable to such an approach. So, of course.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention. Does she, or what's her view on the representations of the Association of Convenience Stores that the maximum penalty in the bill might not be strong enough?
Ashton.
So it's correct to say that the maximum penalty contained in the bill would be up to 1 year in prison and or a fine of up to £10,000. For more serious offences, which I understand to be much more at the lower end of the range. So we imagine that most of the offences will be captured under Daniel Johnson's bill and prosecuted as such. But for some that are very serious, they would have to be prosecuted under the existing criminal law. And for those, they obviously carry much higher maximum penalties. So it would operate in a similar way as the Emergency Protection Workers Bill operates in the same way. So some are prosecuted under that, and then more serious ones are prosecuted under existing criminal law. So it's worth briefly touching, Presiding Officer, on the age verification aggravation, and we can understand why that's been included. There have been some concerns expressed from, for example, Police Scotland, that this could impact mainly on young people. And the Scottish Government agree that this may happen, although it's also worth noting that in cases where the age verification aggravation applies, and this related to the conduct of a young person or a child, discretion would exist in respect of what action to take in respect of the alleged offending behaviour. So with this reassurance, can see the value of the age verification aggravation. Presiding Officer, laws have a key role to play, but they're not the answer to everything. And as I indicated during my evidence to the committee, the Scottish Government is committed to developing an awareness-raising campaign to coincide with the implementation of this bill, which would highlight the importance of reports being made when retail workers are attacked, threatened or abused during the course of their work. Presiding Officer, at decision time, the Scottish Government will be supporting the general principles of this bill, subject to steps at Stage 2 to improve the bill by removing the hindering and obstructing elements. And I look forward to hearing more during this debate to help ensure that the bill can be as good as possible. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call Liam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to contribute to this Stage 1 debate on the Protection of Workers Bill. Daniel Johnson knows that I'm sympathetic to what he's trying to achieve, as we've been actually discussing this on and off for the past 2 or 3 years now. I very much recognise the ills that he seeks to address, having been, as no doubt many across this chamber have, a retail worker myself at various times, and subjected to the sort of behaviour the committee has heard about, though mercifully not with the severity that still far too many must endure. Those who've been a retail worker will recognise it, given that the Scottish Grocers Federation report that 99% of workers they surveyed had experienced violence and physical abuse, and as does evidence that a Scottish shop worker is abused, threatened or assaulted over 20 times a year on average. I also personally witnessed a lone petrol station worker being subjected to a torrent of abuse late one evening around 3 weeks ago, just on the outskirts of Edinburgh, simply because his till crashed and failed to register a loyalty card. Now, I spoke to him afterwards to offer support, and he was clearly very shaken and scared. Did he report it to his boss or the police, as I suggested? Possibly not, for reasons I'll return to later. So, it's not difficult for the Scottish Conservatives to support the principles of this bill today, which the online executive summary to the bill suggests are about increasing the protection for workers in the retail sector. That having been said, there are a number of areas that I feel ought to be explored in greater depth during this process. Now, my colleagues will elaborate throughout, but let me suggest some thoughts which the member may wish to reflect on and perhaps come back on when he closes this debate later. I notice, amongst others, the Scottish Government's memorandum, the Crown Office and the Minister herself just now suggest that the new offence would not significantly expand current legal protection and that many of the proposed elements are covered by provisions in existing criminal law. Now, whether or not that position is accepted, I note the member's response throughout this process that the key here is sending a public message that, in his own words, would communicate our priorities to the public and reflect the seriousness of the crimes that are perpetrated and the duties and obligations that we place on people. Now, leaving aside whether or not the primary aim of the law should be used to send a message, and like the Minister in her evidence to the committee when she said the sending of a message is a sort of secondary benefit, that is something I'm not readily persuaded of. But if the proposed bill fundamentally doesn't create anything new, oughtn't the member to ask why the messaging of the current law isn't working? So shouldn't we be working to establish where the current failure lies and what is required to fix it? Because it might well not be more law. Shouldn't we be asking questions such as, are retail workers not reporting incidents? The member brought up earlier the USDO survey, which I think says only 34% of victims actually report incidents. And if they're not reporting them, why are they not? Is it because they're afraid of the consequences? Or, as the Scottish Cooperative Party suggested, because they're not being taken seriously? Or is it because they're unaware of the current law and their rights? Are the FSB right that only 1 in 10 businesses are actually reporting this as a crime? And if so, why is that? Is it ignorance of the existing law? Is it that the police don't have the time or resources to properly combat this? And if so, I think that's a much bigger issue which won't simply be addressed by this new law. Are there problems at prosecution level? Are cases falling because on an evidential basis, in which case why? And will the proposed requirement for evidence to be from a single source address that? And what message does the current sentencing regime give? What sentences are actually being handed down for this at the moment? Do those fail to send the message that this behaviour is reprehensible and will not be tolerated? Now, I just brought up there, the ACS states their belief that the creation of this offence would act as a deterrent, but presumably only if the sentences given are seen to be commensurate with the seriousness of the crime. And they say the maximum sentence may not be high enough. And I think they might be right, because the penalty under the bill could be imprisonment, as we heard from the Minister, for 12 months or a fine. But it won't be lost on anyone watching and listening to this debate that this Parliament, with the notable exception of the Scottish Conservatives, voted for a presumption against 12 months imprisonment just last year. And that means that those criminals who carry out these acts, who the Minister pointed out are committing what she described, and I know she didn't mean this pejoratively, as lower-end offences, don't really risk prison. They know they'll get a fine or a community sentence instead. And we already know, and I know the member knows this very well, that 1 in 3 community sentences are not completed and 1 in 4 contain no element of work. So I'll ask the member to muse on that throughout the debate and in his closing address the inadequacies and myriad failures of the soft-touch justice approach pursued by this government. And I welcome his conversion with open arms. And whilst that is perhaps a forlorn hope, if we were to note the importance of addressing these underlying questions and acknowledge the importance of enhanced education, training and public awareness as a crucial element of the bill, as the convener earlier on flagged, I think that would be useful. And in summary, the Scottish Conservatives will support the general principles of this bill at decision time tonight.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me declare as a member of USDO and the GMB, declare an interest as a member of USDO and the GMB, who both represent retail workers. I'm delighted to be able to speak in favour of this bill at stage 1 and congratulate my colleague Daniel Johnson for all his hard work in getting the bill to this chamber. I know that the issues that this bill seeks to address are very close to his heart, and I encourage members across the chamber to support the bill and call time on abuse of shop workers. The retail sector in Scotland is Scotland's largest private sector. If the last 6 months have taught us anything, it is just how heavily we rely on this sector and how much we depend on quick and easy access to essential goods. retail workers have played and continue to play such a vital role in keeping our country stocked during the pandemic. They coped with panic buying and the unnecessary stockpiling that took place in the early weeks, and they are the staff who remind us all to wear our masks and keep our distance, something that can often trigger abuse and violence towards them. A survey carried out by Usdaw found that violence and abuse against retail workers had doubled since the beginning of lockdown. So it is truly appalling that 59% of shop workers have faced verbal abuse since the beginning of the outbreak, and a further 4% have actually been physically assaulted. And these figures are just based on those who took part in the survey. And the reality, I think, is likely to be therefore even bleaker. So the claps and cheers for our key workers do mean absolutely nothing if we allow this abuse to continue. The least we can do for them is to ensure that they are properly supported and protected against physical and verbal abuse in their workplace by voting for this bill. There are almost 300,000 retail workers in Scotland, an additional 120,000 hospitality staff that this bill would cover. This is a really significant proportion of the Scottish population that are going to work every day in fear of what they will come up against, and we have the power to help them. The Scottish Retail Consortium tell us that around 10 retail workers are attacked every single day in Scotland. Similarly, the Association of Convenience Stores say that over the past year, there have been 50,000 incidents of violence and threats towards convenience store workers across the UK. In Scotland, we have around 44,000 local convenience stores. In just the last year alone, over 8,000 of them, 1 in 5 independent retailers, experienced violence. It makes me so angry to think of the many independent retailers along the high streets of my constituency that are facing such awful levels of abuse and violence for simply doing their job. And like with any abuse, emotional scars linger long after the physical ones fade. And Usdaw found that abuse in the workplace can be traumatic to deal with and indeed move on from. That's because workers are forced to return to the exact scene that their abuse took place every single day, not knowing if or when their abuser is going to come back to the shop. And even worse, some victims find the attack too traumatic to enable them to return to work at all. And that leaves them without an income and livelihood, while their attacker faces no repercussions. It is also not enough to assume that managers in shops are able to take control of a situation. Not only are they also the ones facing verbal and physical violence, they are often unable to provide adequate support to employees despite their best efforts. So attacks, we know, happen for a variety of reasons, none of which are the fault of the shop worker. And one of the biggest triggers for abuse aimed at shop workers is the age restriction laws and the responsibility that shop workers have to enforce them. The Scottish Grocers Federation's crime survey found that 100% of survey respondents had incidents of abuse when sale was refused or when they simply asked for proof of age. I must admit, presiding officer, it's a long time since anybody asked me for that, but I live in hope. This bill, of course, targets the abuse that shop workers face every day by making these acts a criminal offence. It would also add, as Daniel Johnson has said, aggravation to the offence for abuse against shop workers who are enforcing age restriction laws. This will give shop workers the confidence to come forward and report the abuse that they receive. And far too many abusers get away with it because there isn't adequate legislation in place to hold them accountable for their abhorrent behaviour. So it is time to let shop workers know that abuse is simply not part and parcel of the job that they do, that their suffering can and will stop. This bill must be a warning to all those who have and will continue to abuse shop staff. The law will be on the side of the workers, and offenders will finally have to deal with the consequences of their actions. Can I, presiding officer, congratulate again Daniel Johnson? This is an important and significant achievement.
Andy Whiteman, please, up to 4 minutes.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. And like others, I welcome this bill and commend Daniel Johnson for his work in bringing it forward. Scottish Greens do agree with the general principles and will be voting for it. And as a member of the Economy and Energy Committee and Fair Work Committee, I want to thank fellow committee members, clerks, researchers and witnesses for their diligent work in scrutinising this bill. And I want also to agree with all speakers who have commended the work of retail workers, particularly who in the early months of this pandemic were very much on the front line, meeting and greeting thousands of customers and seeking to police a safe environment, much of which is mandated by laws passed by this Parliament, the latest of which, of course, is the regulation surrounding face coverings. All, of course, which are in addition to existing laws on, for example, age-restricted goods and services that they're required to implement. So I want to thank retail workers for their hard work and doing their bit to keep us all safe. The committee, as the convener said, heard disturbing testimony about the routine threats and abuse facing retail workers. And what I found equally disturbing, in fact, was the sense of helplessness that such abuse would, in fact, be investigated if reported, which I found very, very troubling. And I don't want to get into the arguments as to the scale or nature or character of the police response. The police did rebut some of those allegations, but nevertheless it was clear from evidence that relying on existing offences does not appear to be sufficient to curb ongoing abuse. Now, I'm not a fan, and I don't think Liam Kerr is either, of legislating to send messages, but sometimes a new offence clearly targeted at abusive behaviour against a defined group of vulnerable people is the way forward. And Daniel Johnson mentioned using the law to communicate. I think it should only be used in very sparing circumstances, but I am persuaded that it is the case in this situation, and that a notice on the front door of a shop clearly articulating this piece of legislation will do something in and of itself, just the mere existence, to curb some of the worst excesses. And it's fair to say, obviously, as well, that introducing a new criminal offence is, and nor should it be, ever easy or straightforward process. And I think Daniel Johnson, no doubt, was aware of that when he took up the issue. And the committee, as he knows, spent some time grappling with the legal choices that had been made. In particular, we questioned the need for a new offence of obstructing and hindering. We recognised concerns about the lack of a reasonableness defence to the threatening and abusive element. And I'm pleased to note there's now a measure of agreement on the way forward in relationship to those matters. In particular, I'm pleased that the obstructing and hindering has been dropped. I was never persuaded this was analogous to similar offences against emergency workers, where indeed hindering and obstructing does and can pose a vital threat to life. Presiding Officer, I want to pay particular attention to the question of the aggravated offence where retail workers enforcing a statutory age restriction. We agree with this, but we also agree that it should be available to be pled in any proceedings brought against anyone who is alleged to have assaulted, threatened or abused a retail worker, regardless of whether it's being brought under this offence, other statutory offences or indeed the common law. And we're pleased to note that the government has not closed the door on that possible amendment, because one of the most valuable observations to arise, in my view, from committee scrutiny was the question of why we have not, as a matter of routine, created an aggravation in relationship to all offences we create in law where ordinary workers, whether in public transport, shops, entertainment venues or wherever, are then required to enforce that law, such as age restrictions, and who may, as a consequence, invite and receive abuse or violence as a result. And I hope obviously this bill will be enacted. I also hope that we do learn that important lesson and never again legislate to create offences that we expect to be implemented and enforced by ordinary workers without the requisite protection of the law. Now, indeed, had we been more diligent about this, I think Daniel Johnson may not have needed to bring this bill forward, at least in its current form. Presiding Officer, this is a worthy and welcome bill, and Greens will be supporting it at decision time.
Liam MacArthur, please, up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by offering an apology to the other Deputy Presiding Officer and the Chamber for not being here at the very start of the debate, but also join with others in warmly congratulating Daniel Johnson on getting to this stage with his bill on the protection of retail workers. I know he's put in a tremendous amount of work to develop these proposals, and I think the principles of the bill are ones that deserve the support of this Parliament and will certainly secure the support of Scottish Liberal Democrats. As Daniel Johnson will recall, I'm sure, when he first approached me about lending my support to the bill, I was a bit concerned about the reach and the potential knock-on consequences of what was envisaged initially. I still felt it was important, though, for Parliament to have a chance to consider his proposals, so added my signature to the list of supporters of his bill. And I'm delighted that since those initial discussions, Daniel Johnson quite clearly has worked hard with stakeholders, but also with the Minister and her officials, to hone this bill, which I think will be more tightly focused and therefore more effective as a result in addressing the problems it quite legitimately has identified. Can I also acknowledge and thank others who have been instrumental in getting us to this point. USDAW, I think, deserve particular credit for their long-standing commitment to this issue and their Freedom from Fear campaign, which I gather has been running for around 15 years now. Meanwhile, Scottish Retail Consortium, Scottish Grocers Federation and a range of other organisations have been strong supporters of moves to provide greater protection for retail staff, and I commend all of them for their efforts too. Of course, when this bill was conceived, the principal driver was a desire to take action to address violence, threats, intimidation towards shop workers, often brought about by conflict over the sale of age-restricted goods. There was growing evidence of the risks faced by retail staff faced with the unpalatable choice of provoking anger from customers by asking for ID or potential legal action from police for failing to do so. That, Deputy Presiding Officer, is the very definition of a rock and a hard place. While those problems have not gone away, if anything, they've increased according to the latest crime survey figures. The COVID pandemic, as others have observed, have brought with it additional challenges in this area. Like many members, I'm sure, I recall having conversations with managers and staff of various local supermarkets and shops in Orkney in the early stages of lockdown. They talked of their experience of wholly unacceptable behaviour from customers when asked to abide by government advice or restrictions in place to ensure everybody had access to the food and the supplies they needed. Toilet roll, pasta, bread flour may not be age restricted, but that didn't stop these items being the source of flashpoints in shops and supermarkets up and down the country. In a community like Orkney, though, this all felt particularly inexplicable, uncomfortable and at odds with the norm. At a time when shop staff were going out of their way to help keep people in our communities safe and supplied, the idea that they would be abused and attacked for this is beyond reprehensible. Thankfully, this appears to be a problem that has greatly diminished. The wearing of face coverings is more routine. Panic buying feels like a thing of the past. However, with more stringent restrictions now back in place, there is always the possibility, hopefully not, but always the possibility that we see a resurgence. Either way, the case for the protections set out in this bill, which are focused on the issues arising from the sale of age-restricted goods and services, is one that is well made and deserving of support. As with all bills, there will be a need to scrutinise robustly and amend where necessary. Scope, definitions, penalties are amongst some of the issues that members of the Economy Committee have referred to. Can I also share the hope of Andy Whiteman that, as well as finding a more effective way of prosecuting crimes where they're committed, that this also acts as a disincentive to those crimes being committed in the first instance. For now, however, I congratulate Daniel Johnson once again on the progress he's made. I wish him well going forward and confirm again that Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting this bill at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to the open debate. Speeches of absolutely no more than 4 minutes, please. I don't want to delay decision time or cut out speakers. So, first of all, Colin Beattie, followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee, I supported the general principles of this bill. And it's important that we have a full debate on the important issues that are raised within this member's bill, which aims to increase the protection of workers in the retail section. And I commend Daniel Johnson for bringing this bill forward. At the outset, I would like to thank retail workers across Scotland for the key role that they play within our communities. The coronavirus pandemic has only emphasised how vital retail workers are in our society. This period has undoubtedly been very stressful for retail workers and has presented new challenges to their roles, as people have depended on them to provide access to key supplies, and they have navigated new roles to keep the workplace safe. I firmly believe that all workers should have a right to carry out their duties free from threat or fear. This bill focuses on two main principles. It seeks to create a new statutory offence of assaulting, threatening, abusing, obstructing or hindering a retail worker, and also to allow for the aggravation of that offence where the retail worker is seeking to enforce a statutory age restriction, for example, when selling cigarettes or alcohol. The EFW committee considered a wide range of views in the course of taking evidence on this, and what quickly became clear was that there were elements of this bill which do overlap with existing law offences, such as common law assault and the statutory offence of threatening or abusive behaviour, and that needs further investigation. Yet the evidence indicates that levels of crime against retail workers are already very high, and that these rates are only increasing. And it seems that it's necessary to put something in place which adequately addresses the challenges the retail sector staff are facing. This presents the question of whether the existing laws are adequate in themselves to deal with these sort of incidents, and also as to whether these laws are being adequately enforced. One concern I did have relating to this bill, and I'm pleased that Daniel Johnson is addressing this issue, is how we define the offence of obstructing or hindering a retail worker. The bill does not limit that offence to physical interference. It becomes a matter of judgment as to whether an offence has been committed, and in my opinion that is not a robust principle. Because we should consider whether it's proportionate to make hindering a criminal offence. I believe that we should not be criminalising this, as it's too subjective, and it could result in impairing the life chances of those who have been perceived in a way that was not meant. And I don't think that's a strong enough concept to criminalise. At the beginning of this contribution, I emphasised that there is no doubt that retail workers are experiencing increased levels of harassment and crime. The Federation of Small Businesses noted that, according to its research, the majority of businesses do not report crimes. The Union of Shop, Distributive and Allied Workers have also said that their opinion is that the laws are not being enforced. And I believe that our starting point here should be to persuade retailers to report crimes and make use of many of the existing laws which could be enforced in these situations, by encouraging retail workers to contact the police in situations of assault, threat and abuse, and then we can see a truer picture of incidents, and the police may enforce punishments with laws which already currently exist. I know that the Minister for Community Safety, Ash Denham, has also offered to work with Police Scotland and the Scottish Government's justice partners to explore how data collection can be improved when recording and monitoring criminal incidents in shops, and I'm certain these discussions will be productive. If we can understand the extent of the problem, then it will be possible to work with the police to come up with solutions as to how we can effectively enforce existing laws. Finally, I would like to repeat my thanks to those who work in the retail trade and to offer my support to finding solutions for the challenges faced by all those who work in this sector. I understand the difficulties in enforcing age-related statutory restrictions, and I hope that from this bill we can work towards solutions which will ease the situations that those in the sector are met with. I look forward to further dialogue to create a robust bill with the best interest of workers at the centre.
You know, if everybody has an extra 5 seconds, it makes us late. So, Alison Harris, followed by Bob Doris.
Challenge. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm also a member of the Economy and Fair Work Committee, and since this bill was tabled by Daniel Johnson, MSPs have received a number of very worrying reports about the extent of the abuse, violence and threats that our shop workers face. Statistics from the Scottish Grocers Federation have shown that just about every retail worker in Scotland has experienced some kind of physical abuse incident or violent attack at some stage. Other figures have suggested that the average shop worker is abused on an average of 20 occasions each year. And I know we've heard many other examples of abuse from across this chamber. It's simply not right that by just going to work, you have to consider what abuse you might face. Clearly, this is completely unacceptable, and it's our job as MSPs and legislators to reduce the risk where we can. With that in mind, we're supportive of this bill's aims, although we do have some reservations about how effective it will be. We also cannot ignore the irony of the Labour Party, who are so traditionally weak on issues of justice, suddenly deciding to stand up for victims of crime. The maximum punishment anyone convicted under this new law can receive will be a year in prison. Yet Labour sided with the SNP government last year when it launched proposals to abolish sentences of less than a year, resulting in those people found guilty of domestic abuse, serious drug offences and even significant assault charges avoiding jail altogether and finding themselves back out on the street immediately. In effect, Labour want to create a new law which, at best, will see perpetrators waltz out of court with just a fine or a community sentence. As we know from previous forum, that it's very easy in the SNP's justice system for criminals to dodge fines in full or to shirk community service either in part or sometimes even in full. Much of the evidence we heard on the Economy and Fair Work Committee centred on the fact that attacks on shop workers were underreported, and we heard evidence from both the Law Society and Police Scotland who believed that there were already existing laws in place to deal with the abuse of shop workers. During an evidence session at this committee, we heard that perhaps an awareness campaign was needed to educate people. Firstly, against being violent towards shop workers, and secondly, to ensure that people, once reported the matter, that it would be dealt with properly. I would certainly agree that we need to raise awareness, and I would hope that by educating people, there would be a much better understanding in terms of what is acceptable behaviour. So we have two arguments. There are the shop workers who feel so strongly that some further law is needed to protect them, and then there are those who believe that this legislation is already actually in place. However, for any new law like this to succeed, it has to be matched by tough action at the business end of the justice system. We don't want to see a situation where our shop workers are going to be let down through the court process, failing them. People who are found guilty of this offence must be properly punished. Otherwise, it will soon get a reputation for being toothless and ineffective. So if this law does pass, the Scottish Parliament can't relax, merely satisfied that another piece of legislation now exists. It needs to be constantly monitored, reviewed and improved where necessary. So while we do retain some scepticism about this bill, we agree that something needs to be done for a group of workers who are often undervalued. And as such, we will vote for Daniel Johnson's motion this evening. Thank you.
Bob Doris, followed by Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start by offering thanks that others have done to Daniel Johnson as well for navigating a really robust member's bill, albeit some amendments I know required, but also to the committee as well. And actually to the Scottish Government, from what I can gather, has been really strong, positive, constructive engagement on both sides. And just whisper it, Presiding Officer, sometimes that's what the Parliament does, and maybe we should do it more often. So I think a credit goes to the parliamentary system as well. I take on board, and I won't refer to it, that hindering and obstructing as part of an offence will be removed from the legislation during amendments. But of course, we will have a standalone offence in relation to assaulting, threatening and abusing retail workers. That shouldn't have to be said. Of course it shouldn't, but it does have to be said. No one should be assaulted, threatened or abused at their job, in their line of duty, or, as we've heard, with the aggravated part of the legislation as what can be their legal duty. It's not acceptable, but it does happen, and it happens with a vocal and at sometimes highly visible minority. Now, I've seen first-hand efforts retail workers in my constituency have done to ensure social distancing during COVID-19, assisting with queuing outside supermarkets and the like, encouraging the use of face coverings and seeking to sanitise what is effectively their workplace. And of course, as we've all mentioned, keeping the shelf stacked at the same time. I've also, and I'll say this delicately, and it's not a reflection on the workers at all, I've also had constituents, as I'm sure we've all had, who contact you and they say, and they complain that they feel some shops and supermarkets have not done enough and should do more. And there actually is the rub, the expectations, the stresses and the pressures put on these frontline workers, when what they actually need is the solidarity, the support and the backing of law. And I think that's what Daniel Johnson is trying to secure here this afternoon, and that's why I support it. Now, we've heard the conversation about, well, how many are impacted, how often are retail workers victims of such unacceptable abuses, how many are charged and prosecuted. And I know we don't know, but Daniel Johnson did put on record some very, very robust figures, anecdotal but robust figures from USDAW and from the Scottish Grocers Federation, and there clearly is a problem that has to be tackled. So making this a specific offence will help deal with that data issue and get the actual extent of the problem. But this legislation is not just about capturing data, it's about changing behaviour. And that's why, in tandem with this, it's important the Scottish Government has pledged an awareness campaign on the importance of reports made to the police when retail workers are attacked, threatened or abused in the course of their work. We should never normalise such unacceptable behaviour. Legally unacceptable currently, but we have to make sure it's absolutely socially unacceptable. And we should not be unclear about how quickly things that are very quickly become socially acceptable if we don't do something about it. And I would just say very quickly, in the time we've got, I really don't have time, sorry, the time we've got left, think about how some people treat call centre staff when they get frustrated and impatient. The person's just doing their job, but they get the abuse. Imagine getting that abuse face to face every day at your work. I have to say, when I was at school, I did some jobs in Jackie Bailey's constituency. I sold tablet and macaroni around the doors of Bon Hill. I sold sports socks in the Vale Market, Jackie Bailey, both public-facing jobs. But I preferred being a kitchen porter in Loch Lomond side because it wasn't public-facing. These workers are out every day of the week doing public-facing vital jobs, and they deserve our protection. And I'll be supporting this at decision time tonight.
Mark Griffin, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, President Officer. I draw members' attention to my declaration of interest as a member of USDA and Unite. I'm delighted to support Daniel Johnson's bill and congratulate him and the committee for getting it to the Chamber today. This is a much-needed piece of legislation which sends two clear messages. That retail workers have a right not to be abused or subjected to threats and violence in the line of work. And, if the worst happens, that there is a mechanism in law to help workers get justice because the current system is failing them. And we know that because of the statistics that we've heard from members in the debate today. They're damning, absolutely damning. They make it undeniable that this proposal is more important than ever. And remember, these workers are just doing their job. Many have committed decades to serving their community. 7 days a week, they do it with a smile, often full shifts on their feet. Many of them do it for little more than the minimum wage. They're literally on the front line. They're key workers that have kept us fed and supplied with vital medicines during the pandemic. Risking their own health, they've come into contact with thousands of people, some of those who will undoubtedly have been infected with COVID-19. And while ASDA were saying that they were starting a crackdown on anti-maskers, at the same time, Paddy Lillis of USDA has said yesterday that abuse has doubled since March. The very people helping to disinfect trolleys, self-service tills and ensure distancing have had to face increased threats, abuse, intimidation and, for 3.5% of them, assault. And just as they do when they're performing age checks, retail workers are simply upholding the law and are at the sharp end of implementing public health policy. And just this morning, I spoke to an USDA member at a co-op in my region, and they described their experience of working through the pandemic. People telling them they're not the police, they're not doctors, to F off, that they're just shelf stackers. The irony of the fact that they're stacking shelves to keep the community they serve fed was not lost on that worker. But just as the new offence was necessary before COVID-19, if it was law now, retail workers would have had that added protection throughout the pandemic. Presiding Officer, outside of the pandemic, USDA has accumulated a decade of survey information on this issue, and the results for Scotland reinforce the need for this bill. They find in previous years Scotland's figures have been well above the UK national average, with more Scottish members reporting threats, as well as both physical and verbal abuse. And it's the law enforcement role that they have that triggers the abuse. The British Retail Consortium have reported violence and abuse is up 9% in a year. The Scottish Grocer Federation, members who have responded to their own survey, universally experienced instances of abuse after refusing a sale or requesting ID. And this is what workers representing responding to USDA's Freedom from Fear survey themselves say. We get abuse from customers about the Think 25 policy.
I have had many people call me the C word or the B word. It won't be long before somebody will physically hurt one of us in the shop. Another said, age-related sales customer with no ID started using foul language and threatened to come back at the end of my shift. Then it gets worse. A customer refused sale of alcohol as he was under the influence. He told me I was an F&B and to watch my back as he was going to get me. I think the committee and the chamber have heard just how serious and necessary this bill and the situation retail workers face, and ask all members to support. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to thank Daniel Johnson for bringing forward his bill with the support of USDOR, the Union of Shop, Distributive and Allied Workers, on a matter important to the constituents of each and every one of us. During lockdown, we all regularly clapped our NHS for their phenomenal efforts in keeping our communities safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. In these challenging times, many of Scotland's over 375,000 retail workers have done equally fantastic work. Not only did they provide indispensable everyday life essentials such as food or medicine, but for many of us, they were also a rare and welcome source of face-to-face human interaction. They make a real positive difference to people's lives, and their value should not be underestimated. Sadly, retail workers have recently endured an unacceptable rise in assaults against them. According to associations for convenience stores representing over 33,500 local shops across the UK, last year there were over 50,000 incidents, including verbal abuse, threats and physical attacks. Earlier this year, a woman was taken to hospital after an intoxicated man assaulted 2 female staff working at a local Buttery Hill convenience store in North Ayrshire. We should use increased public attention currently being given to this issue by protecting our retail workers through enhancing long-standing existing laws. I therefore welcome this bill to strengthen legislation and specifically protect retail workers against a minority of customers who assault, abuse or threaten them. It is completely unacceptable that, according to the Scottish Grocers Federation, some retail workers now come to expect threatening and abusive behaviour as part of their job. It's certain that the real number of offences committed is actually much higher than official figures suggest, as many incidents are never reported to police, and a number of colleagues have talked about how the response is not what should be expected. A new specific statutory offence to deter assaults, threats or abuse committed against retail workers would not only raise public awareness of this problem, but also reassure shop workers that the issue is being taken seriously and encourage the reporting of incidents. I welcome the Minister for Community Safety's offer to work in collaboration with Police Scotland and the Scottish Government's justice partners on improving data collection when criminal incidents are reported and monitored on retail premises. We expect our retail workers to uphold the law on a daily basis, not only with regard to current COVID-19 safety regulations, but also when it comes to protecting minors from the harmful damages of early exposure to alcohol. Therefore, it is our duty to ensure the law sufficiently protects retail workers, enforcing statutory age restrictions by requesting proof of age from young customers who want to buy alcohol or tobacco products, for example. For this reason, I also strongly support moves to create a statutory aggravation to the offence of assaulting, threatening or abusing a retail worker in cases where a statutory age restriction is being enforced. The Minister has shown willingness to exchange with Mr Johnson to address some remaining concerns in the bill. I'm not alone in my belief that, in reality, some elements, such as impeding a retail worker from carrying out work in a non-physical way, sets a bar too low for criminal behaviour. Of course, in cases where an obstruction or hindrance is carried out in a threatening or abusive way, this conduct amounts to assault or breach of peace, already penalised under criminal law. I expect remaining issues in the bill to be addressed at stage 2. Presiding Officer, this legislation will improve the working conditions and rights of shop workers to go about their work safely, increasing the legal protection through a new specific offence and highlighting to the wider public the unacceptable threats and physical attacks they often face. The latter is particularly important because ultimately only cultural change and increased public awareness will effectively deter abusive conduct and eradicate violent behaviour in our shops. We should therefore all unite behind an awareness campaign which addresses employers and customers, and I once again thank Daniel Johnson for bringing forward his bill.
Michelle Ballantyne, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Without doubt, this bill has a commendable purpose, and as convener of the committee during the Stage 1 report process, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all those that gave evidence and the committee clerks for all their hard work in producing the report. I also had the opportunity to speak to Mr Johnson, and there is absolutely no doubting his commitment to addressing this issue. And I do believe he was right in his argument with me that there was merit in undertaking this bill as much as anything to raise awareness of the problems, and I think the Minister highlighted that too. The evidence received and heard by the committee left us in no doubt that we have a problem. Dr Cheemer of the Scottish Grocers Federation gave moving evidence on his own experiences after coming to Scotland in 1988, describing how he has been spat at, called names, threatened, attacked, had his tyres slashed and his windows broken, whilst the cooperative representative described it as unprecedented levels of violent, weaponised attacks on their staff. The impact on retail workers is not just physical. Their mental health suffers as a result of trauma and intimidation. And it is deplorable that the culture in our communities has brought us to this debate. It's no surprise, therefore, that there is strong support from the retail sector for this bill. But the comment that struck me strongly during the evidence session was from a representative of the cooperative group who said, "Honestly, I think that we all agree that retail workers do not believe that the police care or that the criminal justice system cares, and they are not sure whether elected representatives care about them because so little is being done. Our debate today should send one clear message: we do care." However, the challenge is that this is a bill to create law for the most part that duplicates and crosses over existing law. The provision of the new statutory offence would carry a maximum sentence of imprisonment for up to 12 months and or a fine of £10,000, as we've heard. But we also recognise that the current government supports a presumption against short sentences, and the bill doesn't significantly extend current legal protections. That said, I am delighted that Mr Johnson has worked with the government to actually address the issue and remove obstruct and hinder from Section 1. Although this would have been a new... although this would have been a new protection, I don't think any of us on the committee were convinced that it was a workable one and that it would set the bar too low and cause more problems than solutions. But I was particularly struck by the fact that there are 248 age-restricted products sold in shops, and these are often the flashpoints for abuse on shop workers. I agree that if we are asking retail workers to uphold our laws, there is a duty to ensure that they are supported and protected for doing so. And as such, an aggravator to be applied when a worker is upholding a statutory duty, and I have to say Andy Whiteman rather stole my thunder on that because he very eloquently described why the committee felt the way they did. And I think that the fact that that is now being taken forward is a very welcome fact, but I too wish that it had been inserted into things like the 2015 Licensing Act. I think it could have saved us a lot of problems now. One of the things the committee heard was conflicting evidence on how the current law is upheld. Police Scotland were clear that they take all reports of violence and intimidation seriously, but we also heard that 2/3 of incidents reported are allegedly not attended by the police. This gap in perception is clearly not helping retail workers' confidence. I'm in no doubt that action needs to be taken to educate and raise awareness of this issue. Our citizens need to understand that we will not tolerate this behaviour. But punishment should be the last resort. We need to target the behaviour at the root cause, a view that is very much supported by the Law Society.
Close, please.
If I have any concern, it is that this bill recognises the problem, but will not necessarily offer a solution. But I do want to thank Daniel Johnson for bringing it forward, and I wish them all the best in its progress through Parliament.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by John Mason, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too at the outset would wish to congratulate and commend Daniel Johnson for all his hard work and his absolute determination to bring this Members' Bill forward and to reach this stage. And I pay tribute in particular also to USDO and its members for their relentless campaign, which has indeed led us here to this debate today. And the focus on the need to protect and to support retail workers has never been more appropriate than at the present time. Indeed, whilst it is important to state for the record that the role that retail workers play in our society has always been of importance, it is self-evident that the coronavirus pandemic has highlighted just how essential retail workers are. For surely no one could conclude other than that retail workers have been key workers in ensuring that we can all continue to access food and medicine and vital goods and services. And whilst many people have been able to work from home, retail workers are obviously not generally in that position. We owe it therefore, Presiding Officer, as legislators to do what we can to ensure that at a very minimum these vital retail workers feel safe at work, that they feel supported and that they feel that the law is indeed on their side. Whilst it has been acknowledged that existing laws do already criminalise much of this unacceptable conduct, I do believe nonetheless that it is helpful to clarify the law in this respect and indeed to send an important signal that this conduct will not be tolerated. And in terms of the actual provisions of the bill in the brief time available, I would wish to note the following. Obviously, a lot of debate has centred quite rightly on the definition of the specific offence to be introduced. As currently drafted, the new statutory offence would include not only assault, threatening or abusing of retail workers, but also obstructing or hindering a retail worker, as we have heard. And the inclusion of the latter has, of course, attracted comment from a number of sources, including the Law Society of Scotland, and I would refer members to my entry in the Register of Interest, wherein they will see I'm a member of the Law Society. The Law Society considered that the term hindering in particular was too vague, and they recommended either that there be an express definition of the term included in the bill or that the term itself be deleted. And they cited in this respect the example of a customer who may have a legitimate complaint which is raised in a reasonable way about a particular good or service. And they queried whether such conduct would fall foul of the proposed legislation or not. And I am pleased indeed to note, as we have heard, that further to discussions between the member, the Minister and her officials, a way forward has been worked out to address the concerns raised and hence to facilitate the Scottish Government being able to support the bill. Other important provisions, of course, include the creation of the statutory aggravation, and I very much agree with Andy Whiteman's comments in that regard. How on earth can we impose a duty on very vulnerable workers to do something, in this case, to check age, and then not feel, put them in the position that they feel that they are not supported when they are carrying out the task that the legislation has tasked them to do. So I very much welcome the statutory aggravation. I also welcome the improvement of data collection and the hopefully greater focus on reporting, and finally the Scottish Government's commitment to mount an awareness raising campaign. In conclusion, our retail workers deserve our support, and the new specific offence will hopefully act as a deterrent, provide confidence and assurance to retail workers, and demonstrate that we recognise the vital role that they play and that they are as entitled to a safe place of work as any other workers. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
The last of the open debate contributions is from John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I've been on the Economy Committee off and on, currently as a substitute, but I was not involved in this bill at all. So I come to it today fairly fresh and would comment on some of the issues that particularly struck me as I read the committee's report. For example, paragraph 22 talks of the low levels of reporting to the police because retail workers have come to accept threatening and abusive behaviour as part of the job. That is frankly awful and totally unacceptable. Some of the figures we have received in briefings are particularly stark. The Association of Convenience Stores says 20% of independent retailers experienced violence in the last year. USDAW says 27% were threatened by a customer. Paragraphs 29 to 37 consider the scope of the bill and who should be covered. And I do note that Hugh Henry's 2010 bill was wider, and the committee has heard conflicting evidence on this point. I guess my own feeling is that retail workers do deserve and need the kind of protection planned. However, other workers clearly do as well, and I wonder if we're going to end up with a plethora of bills, each protecting a different sector. I remember as a councillor in Glasgow being shown video clips of the kind of abuse traffic wardens could be subject to. This ranged from drivers pulling out baseball bats from the boot to having the offending vehicle actually driven at the warden. So I do think other sectors need to be considered at some point. On the other hand, I'm pleased to see that bar staff are included. They also have to challenge customers on a range of issues, including whether they are already under the influence, and that range of issues has increased because of COVID. I've been in a number of bars and restaurants since the fuller lockdown was eased in mid-July, and clearly they've all varied in how they interpreted the regulations. On the whole, I have to say I'm impressed by the checking of age ID, recording of contact details, and ensuring masks are worn at appropriate times. The one most significant factor that I have not seen being enforced has been groups of younger men all out together for a meal or a pint, pretty clearly from different households. All round the one table, no social distancing and no intervention from hospitality staff. And I've seen groups of 5 right up to 11. So hopefully this kind of thing will encourage staff to be able to challenge that kind of behaviour. In paragraph 43, it says that Police Scotland said there would be no significant change in how they go about their business. And that may be because there is already an overlap with existing law. However, it does seem to me that the police are having to prioritise the most serious cases, and presumably as a result of this, it is stated, as in paragraph 72, that there is a lack of reporting, with only 26% of those experiencing abuse reporting these incidents to the police. I guess we have a bit of a chicken and egg situation here. Lack of reporting may mean the police do not see the full scale of the problem, whereas given the volume of incidents, the police inevitably have to prioritise, and I suspect that's always going to be the case. I think it's a valid point made in paragraph 59, in that we do not want to lower the threshold of criminality too much, and I think the Minister used the word discretion in her speech. Criminalising young people for nuisance behaviour may not be the best long-term solution for anyone, and Labour argued against criminalising young people in other circumstances, for example with the Offensive Behaviour Football Act. But on balance, I would agree that we should tighten what is criminal, and then it is up to the police, the courts, the third sector and others to work out what is the best remedy in the individual circumstances. So overall, I am supportive of what the bill is trying to do. I remain a little bit sceptical as to how quickly and how great its impact will be. However, I'm certainly happy to support it at this stage. Thank you.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Sarah Boyack for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to join colleagues by congratulating Daniel Johnson for getting his bill to Parliament today and to this stage. There's clearly more discussion and negotiation to go, but I think that COVID-19 has really brought to the forefront how vital retail workers are for all of us, not just to our economy, but to our day-to-day lives. And I want to thank colleagues for raising that fact consistently throughout this debate today. And I'd also like to condemn retail workers for their capacity to adapt to new circumstances, for their professional and warm approach to keeping us all going, because it has not been easy for them. I visited Scotmid in Portobello earlier in the month and heard from them firsthand the challenges they've had to deal with over the last few months and how important it's been for them as staff to make their customers feel safe, and also to hear about their role supporting local residents. As several colleagues have mentioned, the ACS have sent us a briefing today which highlighted the fact that 20% of independent retailers have experienced violence. That is just unacceptable. But it was even more worrying than that, because they highlighted that robberies and use of weapons was on the increase. That cannot be acceptable in Scotland today. Many members have highlighted USDAW's Freedom from Fear survey, which was carried out before the pandemic. And it reported that more than 6 in 10 retail workers had experienced verbal abuse. A third were threatened by a customer, but with more than 15 assaults every day across all of Scotland's shop workers. And that is a shocking statistic, because although designated key workers throughout the pandemic, retail workers have not stopped facing abuse for simply doing their day-to-day job. And as Daniel Johnson highlighted, that level of abuse has doubled during the pandemic. Now, retail workers, as several have commented, are some of the lowest paid staff in our society, but they actually have significant responsibilities when it comes to enforcing the law, and that's been one of the trigger points, as mentioned by several colleagues. So we have in front of us the chance to pass this bill through to the next stage of Parliament, to drive real change, to offer real protection to shop workers, and to get the detailed provisions in the bill right. One of the comments I found interesting was the low levels of reporting to the police of the abuse that retail workers face. And they highlighted that criminal prosecution depends on the employee and employer reporting the case, and that this simply does not often happen. That needs to change. This bill needs to empower that change. What this bill, if enacted, would do would be to make abusing retail workers a separate offence, which I believe would not only protect retail workers, but raise awareness and encourage reporting. Now, there's been an interesting debate on that in this Parliament this afternoon, but I believe with the increased provision of CCTV in shops, we're also in a better position to see evidence for prosecutions to take place. And as almost every MSP have said, nobody should face abuse simply for doing their job, upholding the law and serving customers. But this bill is going to be key to making sure that that statement becomes a reality. I thought the points made about the importance of changing attitudes was powerful, and several colleagues mentioned that. We do need cultural change and respect for retail workers. So public messaging is important, and I hope in her summing up the Minister will commit to this in her speech today. There are things the Scottish Government could do that would help give this permission, that would set the bar higher. But let's be clear, our shop workers urgently need this bill. I want to join colleagues in thanking Usdaw for their fantastic campaigning. It's been going on for some time, and all those constituents who have written to us across the country to support this bill, to help us get to where we are today. So let's support this bill tonight. Let's take a step to powerful legislation which will change people's lives for the better. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Maurice Golden, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It goes without question that no one should face violent abuse or behaviour untoward at their place of work. But sadly, such violence against shop workers is far too common. And I'd like to pay tribute to Daniel Johnson and recognise all the work that he's put in to get this bill to this stage. He said, with respect to this legislation, unions and employers are of one view, and that this pandemic has increased incidents, particularly due to enforcing safety measures. That's deeply concerning. Ash Denham highlighted the issue that many of the perpetrators were under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and commonly when IDs were being checked or conducted, that these behaviours began to come to the surface. Research carried out by the Scottish Retail Consortium estimates 10 attacks are carried out on retail workers in Scotland every single day. Liam MacArthur highlighted that every corner of Scotland has problems, even his native Orkney. When I worked in a shop in Dundee, I would face threats and abuse on a regular basis, and Liam Kerr also spoke about his similar experiences when he was a retail worker. The Scottish Grocers Federation found that 99% of workers they surveyed had experienced violence, a point highlighted by Alison Harris, who said it was just not right. And it is not just the physical violence that causes harm. Many workers will suffer mental health issues as a result of attacks, not to mention the fear their families, friends and colleagues might feel. It has therefore been encouraging to hear members affirming their commitment to a simple, common-sense proposal in today's debate, that shop workers have the right to work in a safe environment, free from harm and the fear of harm. Jackie Bailey spoke about her anger that so many workers are facing abuse just for doing their job. The member also said that she hadn't been ID'd for a number of years, but I've got to tell the member, if she walked into a shop that I was working at, without hesitation, I would ask for identification. And let us remember the valuable contribution shop workers make to our communities, something that has been apparent to everyone in these past months. Shop workers have been essential in keeping the country fed, maintaining access to medications and ensuring life can go on as normally as possible. And they have taken on new duties, for example, monitoring health and social distancing regulations. That is on top of existing legal obligations, such as age-related sales. Asking shop workers to carry out those duties creates potential flashpoints. As such, I believe that where the law places that burden on shop workers, the law has a duty to protect them. Annabel Ewing highlighted this point in her contribution. Michelle Ballantyne cited evidence from the cooperative group that workers felt that no one cared, and I think Parliament today has shown that we do. Gordon Lyndhurst, speaking on behalf of the Economy Committee, highlighted concerns regarding the scope and definition within the legislation, but recognising the need for action in this area. Andy Whiteman described the bill as a worthy and welcome introduction, and like him, we will be supporting the general principles. It is worth noting that both the Scottish Retail Consortium and the Association of Convenience Stores cite sentencing as a common concern, and we must do more to strengthen sentences. Just as there is scope to go further, we must also ensure the bill gets the basics right, arguably none more important than encouraging more people to actually report attacks. FSB research has shown that just 1 in 10 firms do so. Furthermore, just as we must reflect on where other issues might arise, obstruction and hindering have already been removed with concerns that overlap of existing offences. Stage 2 is an opportunity to explore and discuss these issues in more details, and I look forward to doing that in due course.
Ash Denham for up to 5 minutes, please, Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank all of those who've contributed to the debate today on this very important issue, and it's clear that we all agree that the abuse of a retail worker is totally unacceptable, and I would encourage anybody who's been affected by such criminal behaviour to report such matters to the police, no matter whether they work in a large retail setting or in a local corner shop. As Gordon Lyndhurst said during his contribution, that there are times when the customer is not right. And Bob Doris noted that there is a problem here that needs to be tackled. Kenny Gibson reminded us in his contribution that retail workers have played an invaluable role in our society during COVID and will continue to do so. But unfortunately, it would appear that at times it's all too easy to take such valuable work for granted and for people to show anger when they cannot get what they want when they want it. This should never be the case, and it's so important that retail workers are recognised for their valuable contribution to our society and given the respect that they deserved. So we've learned a couple of things about members this afternoon. We've learned that Jackie Bailey would really like to have her age verified the next time she's at the shops buying some age-restricted products, and I won't mention which type of age-restricted product. I'm sure someone watching this debate will oblige her the next time she's at the shops. We've learnt that Bob Doris used to sell sports socks and macaroons, and we've learnt that Liam Kerr also used to be a shop worker himself, and his mentioning that actually reminded me that when I was 17 I used to work in a fish and chip shop, and I used to work really late into the night, sometimes till 2 o'clock in the morning. And one occasion a customer came in, I can't remember what the altercation was about, but he actually picked up the salt shaker and he threw it at me, and it sort of hit me here, which was quite shocking at the time. So I have every sympathy with shop workers feeling under attack or being abused whilst they're just trying to carry out their work. But I would like to take this opportunity to address a point made by Liam Kerr. As the member very well knows, that the presumption against short sentences is just that, a presumption. It's not a ban, and the courts can, of course, impose a short sentence should they wish to. So, Presiding Officer, as we all know, laws have a key role to play, but they're not the answer to everything, and that's why the Scottish Government is committed to developing an awareness-raising campaign to coincide with the implementation of the bill. Details of such a campaign are going to be developed in conjunction with the Association of Convenience Stores and others in order to develop proposals around what could collaboratively be delivered for an effective awareness-raising campaign. And such a campaign would be designed to support the protection of retail workers across Scotland, encouraging them to report any instances of abuse, threats or violence. And I think it's right that the campaign will focus on those smaller convenience stores where often individual retail workers, perhaps working alone and late into the evening, who can be at risk whilst they're serving the needs of their communities. Presiding Officer, I've been engaging directly with the main supermarket chains to understand their corporate policies and approaches that they have in place to protect staff at work, and I've been encouraged by some of what I've learnt. So, for example, mandatory training courses to deal with incidents are available to staff and managers. Staff are being encouraged to report all incidents to their managers, and stores are being encouraged to report all incidences of violence and abuse to the police. Panic alarms and good quality CCTV being standard, as well as security guards being present, and counselling being available to staff affected by such offending behaviour, and regular calls with other retailers to monitor hotspots across the industry, and repeat offenders being excluded from stores. I'm saddened that such measures are necessary in Scotland today. However, it's important that all retail staff feel safe and that there are effective policies in place to ensure their safety. So I hope this bill will reduce the prevalence of such criminal conduct and help all retail workers know that we take this matter very seriously and we want them to feel safer in their jobs.
I can ask Daniel Johnson to close the debate, please, and if you take us up to decision time at 5:05, please, Mr Johnson.
I'll do so gladly. Can I begin by thanking everyone for taking part in today's debate? I think it's been very encouraging to hear such a broad range of views and to have such constructive engagement from right the way across the chamber. I know the hundreds of thousands of retail workers will be heartened to know that we are taking the issues...
Excuse me a moment, Mr Johnson. I know that we've got a half-empty chamber, but it's awful noisy for all that, so if we could take care, please, Mr Johnson.
I know that those retail workers will be heartened to know that we're taking the issues that they face on a daily basis seriously. Before I go much further, I would just like to restate my thanks to the clerks in the non-governmental bill unit. I'd just like to take a moment to make a clearer point on this. I think it's a very special feature of this Parliament that we have an enlightened process and approach for individual members to take forward legislation. It means that genuinely each of us have that opportunity, and it's one that we take seriously because it's not an opportunity enjoyed by all parliamentarians in all parliaments. And I think we should all recognise that and give our thanks to those clerks. I think perhaps the biggest single point, and one indeed alluded to by the Minister, is actually just how broad a reach retail work has. So many members came forward with stories of their own experiences of retail work, the jobs that they have had in the past. And perhaps that's not a surprise. As we heard from Jackie Bailey, there are over 300,000 people that work in retail. It is the single largest employer in the private sector. In addition, over 100,000 workers in the hospitality industry will benefit from this bill. That's over 400,000 people. And the reality is this, is that retail work is for very many people the first job that they have in the workplace, and indeed the job they take in retirement. And it affects so many different people. But the other broad point I think that is important to make in this debate is one I thought made very well by Gordon Lyndhurst in his remarks, that there is a cultural issue at stake here. The concept of the customer always being right, the customer always being king, has been taken too far. That it has been interpreted by some is that they can have a go simply because the person that they are speaking to is wearing a name badge and standing behind the counter. And if there is one single thing that we need to tackle through this bill, and hopefully other steps that will be taken, it is to tackle that pernicious idea that we have in our society. And indeed, I was glad that Michelle Ballantyne brought up Pete Chima's evidence, because he spoke so movingly about the issues that he faced. And he also spoke so eloquently about the need to put this into law, about the difference that the law can make. And I think that is why we must act in this regard and in this area. But perhaps the most, I think, interesting point raised in the debate was the issue regarding underreporting. It was an issue, I think, that was raised by a number of speakers. And I think there's a number of things to say about that. Look, first of all, I think there is a real need to look at how the police respond to retail crime. Now, I have a huge regard for the police. I have been at a number of occasions with local police officers. I regularly meet with my police inspector. I have good connections all levels of the police service in Scotland. But in my view, there is an issue with the way they respond to retail crime. I have been in the presence of officers who have said that they simply cannot prioritise retail crime, such as shoplifting, because of the value of the goods concerned. And I think when we get to the point where a response is put a retail price on it, we have an issue. But that is beyond the scope of what I can deal with as an individual member of this place. And while I can bring forward laws, I can't instruct the police. I can't take the other measures that people, I think, can usefully and constructively put forward in terms of communication and awareness raising, but I would encourage the government to do so. So a number of other members questioned whether this was necessary. This was a point, indeed, I raised directly with the police. In 2012, this Parliament passed a law, the Police and Fire Reform Act. I'd encourage members to read Section 90, which makes it an offence to assault or indeed to obstruct a police officer. And I asked Police Scotland what the usefulness of that was. And they were very clear. It is about the seriousness of that crime. Because, quite frankly, it is possible to prosecute someone for assaulting a police officer without that section of the Police and Fire Reform Act. But the police were also clear that this was a vital and important act. And it's vital and important because the police are charged with upholding the law. And indeed, that is exactly the same point that with regard to retail workers. We ask them to uphold the law. Therefore, they must have the specific protection of law because there's an established principle in law that when people have those duties, that they have those specific protections through specific offences. Now, I think the most interesting points raised by members were raised by both Andy Whiteman and Liam Kerr regarding whether or not this law breaks new ground and how it would operate. And I think, to some extent, Andy Whiteman's exploration of the aggravation point, demonstrates how this will work. I think, first and foremost, what it will do is require sentences to take these crimes more seriously and to make sure that they have sentences commensurate. That's not to say that that can't happen right now, but it will ensure it will happen. And I think his point around a general aggravation is an interesting one and one that I considered. And again, because of the restrictions that you have as bringing forward a member's bill, I decided to limit my scope to make this very clear. I was worried about unintended consequences, about the aggravation applying to other crimes and having unintended consequences as a result. But I absolutely agree with his point that future legislation where we, impose legal obligations on people must take into consideration both in terms of the consequences when people don't comply and ensure that there are adequate measures to ensure compliance. And I'll close in a moment, Presiding Officer. But Liam Kerr also asked the question of does it expand the scope or purchase of the law? And I believe the aggravation point answers that. You also asked if the penalties were sufficient. And I would simply say to him this, is that the penalties, as they are set out, are exactly the same as they are in the Emergency Workers Act. Hopefully tonight we will pass this bill at stage one. And I hope members will take the opportunity to do so. Because tomorrow, Alex Norris MP, a Labour colleague in the House of Commons, will bring forward the second reading of his bill, which does very similar things. And the opportunity we have tonight is to lead the way. And as we have led the way in the past, we have led the way in the introduction of the smoking ban, which was adopted elsewhere, and despite controversy at the time. And the Scottish Parliament has led the way with regard to minimum unit pricing, which again was controversial, but has led the way. So at decision time today, let us lead the way again. Let's give shop workers the protections they need and the protections they deserve. I urge all members to support the motion this evening and support my bill at stage one. Thank you very much.
That concludes the debate on protection of workers, retail and age-restricted goods and services Scotland Bill, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business. There's one question to be put as a result of today's business, and the question is that motion 22226 in the name of Daniel Johnson on the protection of workers, retail and age-restricted goods and services Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. But I haven't yet closed the meeting. Can I just remind everybody that social distancing is still in place, because we are all getting a bit relaxed about it, and to take great care when leaving the chamber, etc. Thank you. The meeting is closed.